Order, order. Welcome to this morning's session. This is the final evidence session of our inquiry on managing the impacts of street works, an issue that impacts all of us in our constituencies, and we get a lot of annoyed emails about. We'll be putting questions to the Minister, first of all on how street works can be managed more effectively to help minimise, more effectively to improve the quality of reinstatements and the time taken for street works, and minimise the impacts on travel disruption and the quality of roads and pavements. So could I ask you to introduce yourselves, please?
So I'm Lilian Greenwood, and I'm the Minister for the Future of Roads.
Welcome back.
Good morning, I'm Anthony Ferguson. I'm a Deputy Director in the Department for Transport, and I look after a team called Traffic and Technology, which contains streetworks policy.
Welcome. So, can I ask the first question? We've heard that the quality of reinstatement following street works is often very poor. Do you think the local authorities have the tools they need to hold utility companies to account on the standards of their works?
Well, look, I absolutely understand the frustration that's felt for all our constituents when the roads are dug up, and particularly when they're not properly reinstated. We know that lumpy, bumpy streets cause difficulties for everyone, and obviously I reflected on the evidence that you heard from Emma Vogelman at Transport for All, because they have particular impact on more vulnerable road users. So it's important that local authorities do have the powers to hold utility companies to account. The arrangements for streetworks have been built up over quite a long number of years. Obviously, we have the permitting system, and we have quite a lot of regulation in the whole area. There's regulation, there's statutory guidance, there's guidance produced by the Joint Highway Authority and Utility Companies committees as well, all of which is designed to incentivise doing good reinstatements and getting it right first time. And that's what we want to see. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, as you heard through your evidence. But I think the way in which the system has been developed is to try and make that more likely. So one of the more recent changes is to performance-based reinstatement programmes, so that those utility companies that are not producing reinstatements to a high standard then have a higher level of inspections, and obviously they have to bear the cost of those inspections. So the system is designed to incentivise them to get it right, and where they're not getting it right, obviously the local authority do have powers to call them to account. They can go through the re-inspection regime, which obviously costs further money. They can do 2 rounds of re-inspections, which obviously, if it's a faulty re-inspection, the cost is £120. They can go through that twice, and then there's an escalation process. To some extent, it does depend, I think, on the highway authorities using those powers and putting. And I appreciate for local authorities, resources are stretched, and different local authorities will make different choices about how high a priority they make this. But they absolutely can hold authorities to hold utility companies to account, and they should do. That's what we want them to do. But we want utility companies to respond to those incentives and do a better job.
Okay, thank you. And through our questions, we'll give you an opportunity to let us know what the department is doing in terms of addressing those ongoing concerns. Scott.
Good morning. So I don't doubt as an MP and also as a minister you get quite a lot of emails about potholes. And I think we know that when we walk down streets in our constituency that quite often potholes are associated with the poor quality reinstatements that you've been talking about. So is it right that in England they're only guaranteed for 2 years reinstatements?
There's a few things in that question, if I may. The first thing to say is, of course, that everyone will recognise that the state of our roads has become a terrible mess. I don't know whether it's as bad in Scotland as it is in England, but certainly that's one of the issues that gets raised with me very regularly, both through correspondence and just as out and about as a Member of Parliament. Obviously, the reason that our roads are in a terrible mess is primarily due to a lack of investment in them over an extended period, and that's why the current government have made a very significant change to that in England, spending £500 million extra this year, which for most local authorities will be a 40% increase to tackle poor roads maintenance. Now, I don't have a figure for what proportion of the poor state of our roads is down to poor utilities works, but inevitably a proportion of it will be. I don't know, Anthony, whether you've ever seen any data that suggests what proportions.
Well, only internal, but nothing that we could share here, I don't think, but something that we're continuing to collect.
But I absolutely recognise that if there is if reinstatements have been poorly done, that will be a contributing factor to it. And I've completely forgotten the second part of your question.
So really the question was about the 2-year guarantee period.
Yes.
I mean, if I was getting my drive resurfaced, I would expect more than a 2-year guarantee. So why is it okay for utility companies just to give that 2-year guarantee?
So there's a 2-year guarantee for most works and a 3-year guarantee for the deeper works over 1.2 metres. I know that in Scotland they have moved to a 6-year guarantee period, and obviously we'll be interested to see what the evidence shows from that, whether it does make a difference. I was quite, like you, I kind of questioned why a 2 to 3 year guarantee period, but the department did actually consult on this issue, I think in 2019, about whether it would be appropriate to move to a longer guarantee period, and the feeling was no, it wouldn't make a significant difference. Now, I think there's two parts to it, really. One is that usually, if you do if a reinstatement is going to fail, you will see signs of failure within the 2-year period. Obviously, the work that local authorities do to check the quality of reinstatements varies. Some of them will be doing just visual inspections, as you know, as a committee. Some of them will have done the more detailed coring work, which perhaps will give you a clearer indication about whether potentially you would face longer term concerns. I'm open to the idea of looking at how long those guarantees should be in place for, but obviously we'd want to consult on that, and we'd want to see that there was evidence that, given that they are moving in that they have already moved in that direction in Scotland, it'd be really useful to see what evidence comes out of that. Yeah,
but do we really have to wait for evidence from Scotland to know that a 2-year guarantee does seem quite short? And I think most people would expect that reinstatement, and I'm talking about, when I say most people, I'm talking about local authorities as well, would expect it to last for more than 2 years. I mean, it seems one of these things we're saying, well, let's consult and let's collect evidence, when perhaps the solution is obvious.
I don't disagree, except that, as I say, I know that has been consulted on previously and rejected. So I would want to go back to look at the consultation in a bit more detail and see why that was rejected. I don't know whether part of it would relate to the fact that sometimes you'll get multiplicity of reinstatements, and perhaps it would be less clear who was responsible for the defect once it becomes longer ago. But absolutely, I'm very happy to look.
Certainly,
at
when
that
the change
point.
came to Edinburgh, we did realise that you'd have to track the paperwork much better over a 6-year period rather than just keep those shorter term records. But yes,
I mean, our understanding of the consultation was that, funnily enough, the utilities generally wanted to keep it as it was, 2 and 3 years, and that the local authority respondents wanted to extend the time limit because of the cost that they were incurring in, this is what they said, the cost they're incurring in having to reinstate the older than 2 or 3 year repairs. So, and at the time, the department said that it needed to carry out further work on the financial impact, I guess, to local authorities, of implementing such a change. So I just wondered, Mr. Ferguson, if there'd been any progress on having a look at that financial impact.
Nothing explicit. That's partly because it's one of many priorities that we have. That was a kind of pre-COVID thing, and post kind of pandemic. There's been a number of other kind of priorities that ministers have brought forward for us. And no, we haven't. I'd probably just make the general point that any change of this kind is going to require a lot of kind of impact assessment work. So we would need a lot more evidence, just to the point that was made earlier before we're going to even think of bringing forward another consultation, which it would require. It's not untypical that local authorities and utilities come out in slightly different places, and that's often the difficulty that we find ourselves in, is that we've got to balance two quite differing views of the same subject. So no, there hasn't been, but there could easily be, and it's one of many things that we keep under review.
Okay, well, that's helpful for you to say that. Okay, now we'll go on to inspections. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. In 2023, the Department for Transport introduced a new performance-based inspections regime, which means companies with a high failure rate on standards are inspected more often. In your opinions, how successful has this been?
I mean, I think it's still fairly early days in terms of seeing how it's operating. Obviously, it is, as I already said, it is about trying to incentivise good behaviour, and and obviously there is also a financial impact for it. So all companies either began on a 30% sample rate or a 50% sample rate, depending on their performance in the previous year, and that's now update. The information that we have from Street Manager between July and 2023 and July 2024 shows that 101 of the companies that worked in each quarter that year improved their pass rate, and the majority of those improvements was by a few percentage points. 21 stayed the same, 36 have worse performance, the majority of which were telecommunications companies, and then there's only data for the remaining 57 for either first or last quarter, so we can't get... So that would suggest that more of them were doing better than were doing worse, so that's kind of promising. But I think it's, it's still early days. The movement is every 3 months, so they're reassessed every quarter. And the minimum sample inspection rate of 20%. I understand a number of utility companies have moved to that 20% sample rate, but as you heard in your evidence, some have moved in the opposite direction. But it sets a very clear signal to utility companies about what the expectation is. I don't know, Anthony, whether there's anything you want to add.
My main observation would be that we can only say this now because we've introduced this regime and we're gathering the data, so we have information now about relative performance and change of performance over time that is not anecdotal. It's been collected through proper data. 2 years in, we're second anniversary of it. That's, in our terms, it's very early days. We'd need several years worth really to do a proper evaluation. We wouldn't normally be thinking about coming back to evaluating something within 2 years because it's too soon, and it's too sophisticated an organism that you're trying to change. There's a lot of factors in what is determining whether a utility company's performance is going up or down. It will depend on the nature of what type of utility they are, what sorts of works they're doing, the fact of telecoms and broadband rollout companies. There's a lot more operators. That's a very fast growing kind of area with less experienced utility companies. So there's a lot of factors in here that we'd have to separate out to be able to tell whether the trend was going in the right direction and why.
Can I just slightly pick you up on that with telecoms and broadband? A new type of... we've had that for a couple of decades, haven't we?
What I meant was that the number of operators... Okay. There are as many...
Okay.
If you think of the number of types of utility companies there are, so if you break it down by the number of people who use Street Manager, the number of utility companies in each sector, the telecoms number is much, much higher than anyone else's. There are as many of them as there are local authorities.
I understand what you're saying now, and to be fair, I've recently moved house and got a broadband provider I'd never even heard of a year or two before, so yeah, that's it.
It's my point, yes.
Yeah, fair enough.
And one of the things, I should just add also, one of the things is interesting is that not every utility company operates to the same standard in different places, so there is variation, and obviously they'll be using different contractors in different areas. So it isn't even with one. I'm not going to name one utility company because I'll upset them. But even with one utility company, is they might be performing well in one area but not so well in another, and that might depend on the contractor they're using. But equally, I would expect that if you were seeing poor performance, it's entirely legitimate to pull them in and
Yes, I mean, members of this committee have experienced that extreme inconsistency in standards, even from one provider. Okay, thank you. Steph?
Yeah, strikes me that telecoms operators in particular are not waiting for 2 years to see how the impact of legislation and regulation performs on their business model. They're making quite assertive commercial decisions, and far be it from me to cynically suggest any of them are gaming the system commercially in order to get on with the installations and deal with the perhaps lack of experience in the workforce, etc. But some of the respondents that we've seen from local authorities have suggested that the limitation to 2 inspections is really creating a price incentive to just do the work, do it badly, move on to the next job, pay the fee, jobs are good. Do you have any views on this? Should the cap to the number of inspections be lifted? Would that help?
So, as I understand it, is that we've moved from a position where there used to be unlimited numbers of re-inspections to a situation where there are 2 inspections and then it goes into an escalation process. Obviously, the thing that we want is not for utility companies particularly to be paying fines. What we want them to do is to do a decent job the first time, and if they don't do a decent job the first time, to absolutely correct it. Obviously, there is an extra cost of if they come back to do the reinstatement, they have to apply for another permit. There's a cost of doing that. They have to pay people to come back and do it. So, I mean, I do think there's always a risk, as you say, that a utility company, particularly if they don't feel like they've got a long-term relationship with that local authority, that they might try and game the system, and we absolutely don't want them to be able to do that. That is not what we want to see. I don't know, Anthony, whether you want to add anything.
No, I think I would observe that I think the what we were seeing a few years ago has improved. We've definitely seen kind of improvements in performance, not just because we've brought in the kind of performance-based approach, but just generally there's been a lot of focus on broadband rollout. I suppose I should observe that in a system that is already complicated and difficult to regulate, there is separately elsewhere in government a very big push for more broadband rollout. It's very much linked to supporting economic growth. So there is inevitably tensions between sort of the fundamentals of trying to make sure that roads keep running, because that's also supporting economic growth, but also improving and adding to the services that run through them. And broadband has probably been the kind of poster person for that campaign, because it's been such a big push from government centrally.
Absolutely. I think most people would accept that the inherent conflict there is satisfied by the sustenance of disruption in the interests of connectivity, but not poor quality of work. And we're clearly talking about a broad spectrum of operators here. And I suppose what I'm particularly interested in is the sort of regulatory flaw that is ensuring that no operator can perform below a certain standard. And this particular issue of inspections and penalties, it's only a few £100, isn't it? You could just sort of do the job badly, wait for 2 failed inspections. Of course, the escalation, theoretically, is local authority carrying out the works and then recharging the reinstatement. But
seem reluctant to do so.
Well, I think it's resource. It's resource. That's what they've told us. They tell us that they can't. They can wait a long time for companies to do the defects themselves. When they end up in a situation where the utility company isn't repairing the defect themselves, they just don't have the resource to go in and do it and reclaim the cost. That itself is a whole other operational thing. So I wondered if you think there should be timescales introduced for this, and a separate or more escalating penalty regime, for example, that doesn't rely upon local authority resource to actually fix the problem.
Well, I mean, obviously there is an escalation process already written into the regulations, which is after 2 failed inspections, then there are a 3-stage process, which involves the Hawk committees at a local and regional level, so there can be escalation. I mean, I think...
But forgive me, there's no actual penalty in that. It's a few £100 if you add everything together. The cost of finding this workforce in a scarce market, making sure that the quality is good in the first place, is outweighed or underweighed by the small penalty. Even if you go all the way through the escalator, the price doesn't, for example, go up every month that they haven't completed the inspection. That would be quite an effective way of ensuring that the utility companies complete the repairs or the reinstatement works.
I mean, I think it depends on what motivates utility companies. I mean, I know... my own experience of seeing, where you've got a poorly performing broadband provider who comes into your area and they get a lot of bad press is it does kind of motivate them to say they're going to do something about it. And obviously you can use that escalation process to hold people to account. That it might not, there might not be a fine beyond the first 2 payment charges for doing re-inspections, but you do have to send your management team up to, to turn up to a meeting and to account for themselves. There's absolute... In a better utility company, you would anticipate that senior management would be seeing that that their more junior management teams or more local management teams were being pulled into escalation meetings, and they'd be asking what on earth is going on, and we need to sort this out. And certainly that's been the case with some of the operators we're aware of.
So you're satisfied with the current enforcement of poor reinstatement? You think that's good for now?
I'm very willing to look at further developments, and obviously we welcome the work that the committee is doing looking into this, and if there are recommendations for how it could be done more effectively, then we will certainly, be very happy to consult with local authorities and utility companies to see whether there is a better way of doing it. That said, I do think we already have processes. Some places, I think, use them more effectively than others. And it's whether there's actually a need for more powers, or whether it's resources to use those powers effectively, or whether it's the choices that local authorities make about where they're going to put their limited resources. And that, is a choice that it's for local authorities to make, and we wouldn't seek to, in a time when we're talking more about devolution, I think there's an opportunity for them to do more. The other thing I would say is that there are examples, I think, of in certain particular areas where other people have used their powers. So, for example, I'm aware that in London, the Mayor of London has pulled in utility companies to kind of hold them to account when there was evidence of poor performance. And obviously that's a coordinating role, because for the most part those responsibilities are held by local boroughs. But that could be something that that mayors could look to do in other areas too, I think.
Although, of course, the mayor, there are TfL roads as well, so there are some roads that the mayor is responsible for directly. Yeah. But yes, that's a fair point. Could I just push you, Minister, because you talked about the financial constraints that we all know that local authorities are under, and some of the local authority witnesses have told us that the inspection fees that are chargeable to utility companies do not cover their costs of inspection and re-inspection and having to deal particularly with poor performing operators. Do you think inspection fees should be higher?
I think that if local authorities want to provide evidence in relation to the need to increase obviously we have heard that, and I think that the request has been from the department for further evidence from local authorities in order for us to look at whether that would be a reasonable thing to do. Obviously, whenever we're putting cost into this, it is ultimately going to end up with citizens one way or the other, either as purchasers of utilities, which most of us have no choice over, or as citizens paying for it as taxpayers. Absolutely, will want to ensure that they're meant to cover costs. They're not meant to make a surplus, but they're not meant to be out of pocket for doing essential work. But obviously, we need evidence that would allow that to be considered.
I just come in very briefly on that. Just to be clear, though, we're talking about the costs if things don't go the way they should. Yeah. So in the ideal world, there would be no cost to pass on to the consumer, because the threat of the cost in a competitive market would mean that they did get it right first time. So local authorities putting up their charges actually, in the best case scenario, would not pass on to the consumer at all. Am I right in understanding that?
So obviously inspection. For inspection fees, those are fees for going, for undertaking the inspection. You're going to have to undertake the inspection whether you find a defect or not. But and that's why the higher they're higher if you're required to pay for more inspections.
The one thing that seems very very ingenious about the new regime is that it inspects higher performing operators less frequently. So if you get it right, you're going to get lower fees in that regard. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that point, if the reinstatement does fail outside the guarantee period, it's a taxpayer that picks up the cost anyway, so there's an incentive to get it right at the start. So I think You know, I think evidence shows that where you have a utility company that expects its contractors that checks their contractors by coring their reinstatements, it shows that that drives up performance. We've had a coring programme in Scotland for 20 years now, and there's an argument that that has driven up performance. Is it time we cored more in England? Is it time we had our own coring programme in England?
So I think, I saw the evidence, provided by the Commissioner in Scotland, and obviously what he said was that it's the road authorities who carry out the coring, and he operates in a coordinating role. Obviously, there are local authorities in England who do coring. The committee heard evidence to that effect, and I don't think that there's nothing to prevent there being some coordination. Obviously, we don't have a commissioner in England. The scale the scale would be quite substantially different. I think in Scotland the number of works in the last year was something like 106, just over 160,000. In England we're talking over 2 million. So to create if you wanted to create a coordinating body of that sort, it would be quite a substantial investment, and obviously it would be another arm's length body which we're supposed to be moving away from. That said, I think there is the opportunity for more coordination, and particularly as we develop, we've got more mayoral combined authorities, it could be that local authorities want to work together to share information about coring programmes that they're doing. There's no question in my mind that coring can be a valuable thing to do, because you're not doing a visual inspection, you're looking at what's below ground.
So rather than expecting local authorities to do it, we could use the word expect rather than mandate. You're encouraging them, and maybe also encouraging utility companies to have their contractors, to code their contractors' work, to check that as well. So it's encouragement rather than expectation.
I think the way that the guidance is set up is it sets out how to do coring, and and I think local authorities would understand the value of that. Anthony, I don't know if you want to.
No, I think that's right. I mean, our job is to create codes of practice and guidance that can work and will apply, but that's the role of government, because clearly it's a very localised issue. As the Minister said, there's no reason why a coring programme could exist today. The Joint Authorities Group could agree to have a coring programme. There's nothing stopping anybody doing it. I suspect that the amount of coring that goes on is probably more down to resources locally. So those are kind of local decisions. I detected from some of the evidence that was presented was that there's perhaps an aspiration that there could be funding for more coring, which is a slightly different issue. So that's looking to central government to fund something, to provide resources to do it, and then you're into the difficulty of competing priorities. So there are two slightly different things there, because at the moment there's absolutely nothing preventing a local authority from doing it. There's nothing stopping local authorities talking to each other about how they do it, whether through Hawke or whether through JAG UK. As the Minister said, with the increasing number of combined authorities, with looking to manage transport on a more strategic, kind of coordinated, joined-up way, there's a natural place for that sort of discussion to happen, which, if you think about the scale of something like Greater Manchester or the West Midlands, is probably in terms of works numbers isn't so very different to Scotland. So that you could be talking about a number of regional kind of coordinated programmes or approaches to coring, because it's not necessarily a programme of coring, it's an approach to how much of it you need, and a little bit like our performance-based inspections, thinking about, well, where would you target it, because you're not going to do it everywhere randomly, because that wouldn't be a cost-effective way of doing it.
If you don't mind me, you started off saying, well, we just set the framework and local authorities work within that. So that's quite hands-off, but I guess if you're looking at that framework and you're thinking, well, it's not quite working right, it's time to get a bit more interventionist. So you don't think you're at that stage then in England where you do want to get a bit more interventionist? You still think it's okay for you just to set your best practice and your framework and just like local authorities get on with it? You're not concerned about performance in this area?
I think I would say...
I'd love to answer it, but I think the Minister should probably have...
Well, I'm going to let you have a bash as well. I mean, I think I am concerned about performance, but if local authorities are telling us that the performance, that utility companies are not performing well enough, The scheme that we've got obviously has developed over a period of time precisely to do what you're asking, which is to say, okay, it's not we don't think it's performing as well as it should. What shall we do now? And that was, permits were introduced under the last Labour government. The performance-based regime was introduced in 2023. These are specifically things that have been introduced to try to improve the way that the system operates. I think, it is an iterative process. There's not going to, I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think there is a silver bullet. I think it is about, developing the system that we've got to try and make it work better, unless someone has some radical suggestion for a completely better way of doing it. But anyway, Anthony, go on. Why not have your say?
Probably mischaracterised what I was trying to say. I don't think we're hands off. I mean,
I was putting words in your mouth.
No. But I think the point is we're not hands off. Quite the opposite. I mean, there's a lot of regulation. So a lot of what we do are statutory codes of practice. So they're not a leaflet about what good looks like. It's actually saying this is something that you have to have regard to. The specification for how you do reinstatements is in a statutory document. So government is quite interventionist, and quite a lot of what we do is through secondary and primary legislation, largely secondary. So there are a lot of rules that we are imposing on and performance-based inspections is a requirement. It's not a suggestion.
So sticking with coring, I think some of the data we showed says that in particular local authorities, there's higher failure rates in the coring. So does that concern you? Do you think that's down to the local authority, what they're doing, or do you think it's perhaps, we talked earlier about specific contractors working in specific areas causing problems? Have you got any comment on that issue? How higher failure rates in certain local authorities when it comes to coring?
I'm not sure what conclusions you draw from that, because I mean it's in the nature of almost everything to do with local roads that you get differential. You get data showing you that there's different performance and different approaches, and that's partly because the decisions are made locally. Why you would do coring samples in one area and find a different result to the same type of reinstatement, say a deep excavation for a sort of water apparatus or whatever it might be, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to do quite a lot of work to get to the bottom of why that was happening and what was the kind of cause and effect there. Because I suspect there'll be a number of different reasons. We went through a lot of this when we were redoing the SROH, which is one of the kind of core statutory documents that we produce, and there was a lot of discussion about detailed technical specifications for how it's done. But that's as much as we can do, and then we sit, we evaluate. It's really for the local authorities, because they're best placed. They're the ones who are actually seeing the reinstatements. We're not out there. We're not the police. We can't be. There's only a handful of us doing the policy role. But what we do need, as the Minister said earlier, if there is evidence in the same way that, that the inspection fee is not enough to cover your costs, I can absolutely guarantee that you'd get a different answer 150 times or 130 times, 20 times if you were asking outside London to that question, because every local authority runs itself differently, and
which is a strength. But
and that is a challenge that we have, is trying to have a single consistent national system when there is so much difference and between different utility companies and different regions.
Thank you, Chair.
I mean, JAG UK, which is effectively the Highway Authorities group, called for a national coring scheme, so there's consistency across coring testing. So, and they say a wide coring scheme needs to be established. Would the department consider a similar system as in Scotland?
The obvious question is who's going to pay for it? Because as I understand it, in Scotland, the local authority, the road authorities are paying are doing the coring, but there's a national coordination. In England, there are some local authorities that have coring programmes. I know we heard that Salford do within Greater Manchester, and I think North. I forget which local authority one of your witnesses was representing, but it obviously isn't uniform across the place. I think that would have to. There would have to be some agreement from local authorities about if you were going to have you could. Well, have
it was their sector group that is calling for that.
But they may be kind of wishing that that DFT would decide we were going to pay for a national coring programme that would be over and above the funding that local authorities receive.
Okay.
Which might be somewhat wishful thinking at this point.
All right. No, that's a fair point. Okay. Alex, going to move on to disputes, mediation and working relationships.
Thank you, Chair. There can sometimes be disputes between local authorities and utility companies, and we've heard in evidence that can especially be around what I've learnt are called Section 81 defects. We understand that there may be some ambiguities in government guidance, and I wondered if the department had any plans to update that, and also whether you thought the processes to resolve disputes could be improved.
I mean, I think I'm not going to comment on Section 81 because, surprisingly, I can't actually pick out of my head where that is. So I'm going to turn to Anthony for that
Ferguson.
one. But in general terms, I mean, I think, and this is what it's always very difficult to legislate for, is good relationships. You know, where this works well is where you will have utility companies and the managers of the highway authority, where people have regular conversations, where they pick up the phone and talk to each other, and in some cases where you have people who are co-located actually to ensure that there is that kind of good communication and correspondence. But inevitably, because it's a regulated, quite highly regulated system, that does also set up for there to be adversarial relationships and arguments about, well, have they or haven't they done something right? I mean, to come back to the reinstatement issue, is I don't think it would be that much of a surprise if sometimes the highway authority would be saying this reinstatement is inadequate, and in some cases the utility company will be disputing that. I think if you've got a good relationship developed over a period, there'll probably be more likely to reduce that kind of those opportunities for adversarial situations. I mean, at the end of the day, hopefully we all want the same thing, albeit there are conflicting issues. The highway authority wants its roads to be kept clear and and not to have anybody interrupt its integrity. Utility companies have got a job to do in terms of getting down to their utilities and fixing problems and installing new utilities. Anthony, do you want to come to Section 81?
I'd love to, because
reflect where it is.
We all worry about noisy manhole covers. I have one at the end of my road. So I wasn't quite sure I mean, you're right, that this is one of a number of tools that the Highway Authority has to ensure that not only is work done correctly, but then apparatus in the street is maintained, and noisy manhole covers is often, I've heard this mentioned many times as being, it's an annoyance locally, and utility companies are very slow to come out and fix it. Again, it's one of these things which is very difficult at a kind of national level to know what it is that we need to do. The powers exist in the new Roads and Streetworks Act that give Highway Authority the power to give notice, issue notices to the utility company to carry out work. To some extent, if there is the power to do that and the utility company simply doesn't do it, it's a little bit hard to know, what more we could do. It's one of many things that we probably could sort of keep under general review, and this is one of this is on a kind of list of topics that regularly comes up, because I think it's a kind of local annoyance, but it's probably the sum total of lots of fairly small scale kind of local issues that really it's much better to be dealt with locally. As far as we can see, that in terms of our priorities, this probably isn't a particular priority to deal with, because the powers do exist. So the question is, are the powers that exist being used, and if not, why not? But it comes back to a little bit more to the point about, holding the utility companies to account at a kind of local level and using all the kind of tools that are available to local authorities already, I think.
We've also heard that some disputes are referred to the Highways Authorities and Utilities Committee, but one of the issues is that it's a very balanced committee. So you've got exactly the same number of utility companies and highways authorities, and therefore they kind of tend to side with their own side when making a decision or having a discussion. Do you think there might be a need to put an independent person or people on that committee?
Do you want to?
I was going to say, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I don't know whether it's been examined previously. They have co-chairs, don't they? But yeah. Precisely for the reason you say, that it is meant to, I guess it's meant to be sort of providing a group of your peers who are going to say whether they think you've acted in a reasonable manner or not.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that what you described there in Hawke with a sort of equality of representation. So both in a what can be a fairly adversarial system, I think we would say it's a good thing that there is this organisation that brings together people where you can have a balanced, sensible debate. We rely very heavily on Hawke, so that because they produce lots of good practice guides and so on, which we think are very helpful. Whenever we do develop anything of our own, then we work with Hawke to make sure that they have been involved in providing us with a balanced view of what the sector wants from whatever coordination code or whatever it might be. So I think we see value in that. I think sometimes, and this is I'll call this a personal opinion, that sometimes I think where Hawke comes up with a solution that is a balanced compromise, not everyone's going to be happy about it. So if you're not happy about it, then you'll say that Hawke's it's lent too much one way or too much the other way. But I think in general terms, the fact of that having that kind of balanced representation across the sector, I think it adds more value than creates difficulty. Whether there's scope for inviting Hawke to have, because we have a lot of interaction with Hawke, sort of semi-officially, so we're not members of the committee necessarily, but we do look to them and they do look to us, because ultimately we're often the ones producing the code of practice or whatever the guidance document is. So to some extent we provide that independent mediating position, because we, as I said earlier, in lots of examples we're the ones having to balance quite disparate views and come to a conclusion which is fair across the board, which will allow utilities companies to do what they need to do, but in a way that's effective and avoids unnecessary disruption, which is, I think, is our goal.
Well, that probably leads us on to Scott's question.
I didn't realise another question.
8?
Apologies. Yeah, so I was going to intervene in this one anyway, actually, so thank you.
We've touched on it already, but I think we can push on this one.
So I do have to say that, I mean, we've talked quite a lot about Scotland this morning, which is always good, of course. But what I would say is that it's not that Scotland, well, certainly my perception of working between Scotland and England, it's not that Scotland certainly doesn't feel different in Scotland in terms of how roadworks are managed. And I'm going to ask about the Scottish Roadworks Commissioner in a second, but I was just checking, their budget's less than £600,000 a year, which is less than £20,000 per Scottish local authority. So you can see actually how much they could achieve with that budget is quite limited. But do you think, you talked about Quangos earlier as well, it's also an extra layer between residents and Scottish Government, etc. So it is an extra layer. But do you think there's value in that kind of organisation to ensure that local authorities, or your roads authority, is better regulating roadworks to try to avoid the kind of clashes that we all experience all the time, even in Scotland with the Scottish Roadworks Commissioner? I could talk at length about the ones in my constituency, but I won't be tempted to.
I mean,
is there a place for it? Is there a place for it?
From the public's point of view, you would want to ensure that there is someone who is managing your local roads and trying to minimise disruption on them. I mean, I guess from a public point of view, we'll probably all be in the position of sometimes being very frustrated when our road is disrupted or dug up and it delays our bus or our journey. But equally, if we have a power cut or our water gets cut off or we can't or our broadband goes down, we also have an expectation and a desire for it to be fixed as soon as possible. So there's an obvious and tension that exists at all points. Absolutely we want there to be someone who is holding the ring, but in general that should be the local authority. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't think that the Commissioner in Scotland has significant powers that the local authorities don't in England. I mean, I think, or between the local authorities and the department. So obviously I can see why it would work in that setting. I think there are, but moving from the system we have to a system of a commissioner, I think would be quite challenging.
Yeah.
Both in terms of resource, but also it's a different system. There isn't a permit system in Scotland. It's a notice system. I think it only deals with street works and not road works. And we're kind of ignoring all the disruption and potential issues that are caused by Highway Authority's own works, which from the perspective of the public, well, they probably don't generally notice who it is who's digging up the road.
Yeah, from the public's perspective, though, it's the coordination piece that frustrates them. The fact that, you know, there's roadworks just repeated in the same areas, or there's lots of long periods of activity, and that frustrates the public.
We'll come on to that.
No, sorry,
element.
I'll build up to the question.
But it's the dispute resolution element that some of our witnesses said. You know, there's as Alex said, there's equal power in the dispute resolution between the two sides, whereas the Scottish Commissioner, the role, to some extent, takes that dispute resolution to that person who's independent and makes the ultimate decision, and that's what we were looking at in this context.
Whether there needs to be some escalation to an appeal body, is that the kind of thinking?
Yeah, but it goes back to the point I was saying earlier. I mean, the £20,000 per local authority in Scotland, it's not a lot of money. But to fund that, so I wouldn't argue against the need for Scottish Roadwork Commissioner to have more money. But then where does that money come from? It would probably come from local authorities. And that's the decision you would be faced with. You set up this huge organisation that would have to be across all England to run this service. Where would you find the money from? It would come from local authorities. I mean, that's
a point the minister has.
Might not be very happy about.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
I do think there's an opportunity, or there could be an opportunity for local authorities to actually agree themselves, particularly at a regional level, which wouldn't be on, or a mayoral strategic authority level, to decide that they were going to. It wouldn't be exactly, it wouldn't be exactly the same as a commissioner, but to set up that kind of coordinating role, and we could look at that.
It's a point that has been raised with us, and we did have the Scottish Commissioner in front of us, as you know. So now let's move on to coordination and planning to minimise disruption, travel disruption being the big issue that our constituents raise with us. Elsie.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. We know that poor notification of street work can obviously have really disruptive consequences. We know about impacting bus services and impacting pedestrians as well. In particular, I'm thinking of Castleton in my constituency, where the development of a cycle lane caused considerable disruption for residents and for businesses. They really bore the brunt of that. How can the notification process be improved, and who do you think bears responsibility for that?
So the permit scheme was specifically introduced in order to try to minimise the impact of disruptions when there are works going on on the carriageways. So, I mean, obviously, if it's installing a cycle lane, is roadworks undertaken by the Highway Authority rather than street works undertaken by utilities. So the permit system is specifically set up for that purpose. As you know, there are different different amounts of notice that need to be given for a permit. The difference between Scotland and England is that you're applying for permission via a permit rather than giving notice that you're going to be doing something. So the local authority has some powers to have conversations with the promoter to sort of say, well, we want you to work at these particular times or avoid working at these particular times, which can be particularly thinking about, well, when's the busy time of the day, can you avoid working on the bus route, what traffic management is going to be needed. That's what the permit schemes are designed to do. Now, in an ideal world, you'd have the advance notice long before you get the permit, because obviously if you're going to coordinate effectively, the more notice that you have, the more possibility there is of that happening. And we know that there isn't always advance notice given, but that comes back to that issue about creating really good working relationships, making sure that the Highway Authority are trying as far as possible to get not only their own works actually, because it is, these things work well and should work with looking at both roadworks and street works, to provide advance notice so we know that when different works are going to be happening in a street in advance of getting the actual permits themselves. And obviously the opportunities for coordination and for dissemination of information are different depending on what sort of works they are. For the more major works, obviously there's longer advance notice required. The permit has to go in earlier, and therefore there's much more opportunity to cascade that information to enable people to kind of minimise the disruption arising from it.
Just to sort of push you a bit more when it comes to that point about disruption to businesses, it'd be interesting to know whether the department's provided any guidance to contractors to mitigate the costs to businesses if street works do kind of affect, are close to the site of their operations, or are there any steps you think that should be taken really to support businesses when disruption happens?
I mean, my instinct is that should be part of the conversation that's happening with the local authority, who'd be acting on behalf of their local their local residents and business owners. Is you would want to minimise the impact that any works on the street are going to have to both to individuals, to businesses, to the provision of public transport, and obviously local authorities are best placed to kind of have the conversation in relation to their own individual roads, because they will know the nature of the streets that we're talking about, like where are the businesses, how do you ensure that there's good access, how do you make sure it doesn't stop people from travelling to or getting to the local area. I mean, I don't know, Anthony, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's largely it. I mean, I wasn't sure whether partly what your question is implying about support was whether we mean financial support for businesses, so kind of compensation, loss of business type support.
Yes, sometimes businesses are obviously left out of pocket as a result of disruption. Is there anything in particular that you think could be done there?
So I think there's a fairly long-standing principle that, because I think we'd be on a fairly slippery slope here about businesses not being entitled to a particular kind of expectation. So a local authority wouldn't normally get involved in compensating a business for disruption caused by works outside, or a utility company for that matter. So I think what we're really into the business of is minimising disruption. It's about notification, about mitigating, about planning around the impact and trying to minimise the impact on a particular business. But there will be times when you cannot avoid excavating outside someone's business. I sat in a cafe in High Wycombe trying to enjoy my breakfast while the local authority were busy planting trees, which involved cutting paving slabs, and the chap who owned the cafe was saying, well, basically no one is having breakfast in my cafe at the moment apart from you, because they're all going round the corner. So that was one of those things where there's nothing much you could do about it. They had to carry out the works. So the question is, when are they carrying out the work? So so there's also negotiation and discussion that can happen around the detail of any particular work. But I think if we get into the category of business support or compensation, then I think it gets much more difficult, particularly for the local authority.
Okay. In terms of any other measures that aren't compensation like that, is there anything else that you think local authorities should be doing?
Well, again, I think it's one of those things where there's always a lot more you could do. I suspect no one's ever completely satisfied that a work has been properly planned, properly notified, that fair warning has been given to businesses. But there's nothing stopping that happening. Local authorities are carrying out, and utility companies are carrying out works like this all the time. So I think the whole issue of communication, I don't know if we're going to come on to that more broadly, is a difficult one, because if there's going to be a road closure, there are processes in place in statute for how a local authority will make a traffic regulation in order to close a road, and there are processes attached to that around consultation and communication. But I think, as we all know, consultation and communication with the public is very, very difficult because people aren't necessarily that receptive. So local authorities do an awful lot of communication. Whether it's received is a different matter. And to me, in my entire career, trying to work out, we've been trying to struggle with the idea of how best and most effectively to communicate with people when you've got some people who only get their news from social media, other people who want a leaflet through the door. There are a number of challenges, and I think businesses are just an example, a subset of that same challenge of how do you make sure that you've had the proper discussion, because it all takes time and it costs money. So the utility company and the local authority are having to expend resource to try and find the best way to communicate about something that is going to happen. The question is how. So it's a challenge.
It's no comfort to a small business if their customers can't get to them or use their business for a period of days or even weeks. Steph?
You've just delicately summed up the issue about local authorities' definition of communication, which ought to be about whether the message has been received, not whether it's been sent.
Yes.
Just on the point about relationships with or between utilities companies and local authorities, just to sort of offer and ask you for some comment on this slightly different perspective, which is, as a county councillor, I was called to a meeting in one of the villages in my division, which had very nearly been completely cut off from both directions due to emergency works. And I don't want to go in that rabbit warren just yet, but it struck me that the relationship between the county council officers on the ground and the streetworks operative on the ground was very strong. The challenge is that actually the sympathy lies with the poor team that have been given the job sheet for the day and want to get on with their work, or even the week before. So do we not need some sort of penalty or enforcement regime sitting behind those relationships? Otherwise it's just people in offices with no stake in the ground at all, giving the problem to the people who are on the front line.
My next question might help with
Okay,
that.
could I just just want to pick up one point, because and apologies if you have mentioned this and I might have missed it, but in your evidence you mentioned plans to consult on a new code of practice for safety at streetworks and roadworks in spring 25. I think we're almost into summer, judging by today's weather. What are the main areas you think should be improved to maintain accessibility in streetworks, and are we going to get that consultation soon?
Yes, and I think actually ensuring access for people, and I was, listened very carefully to the evidence that was provided around accessibility and the impact that it has on particularly on disabled people, and I think ensuring that we strengthen the code of safety in that aspect, in that regard, is very important. I don't know, Anthony, whether we've got any more detail on when the time frame is likely to be for.
Not specifically. I hate to say that spring, notwithstanding the weather, spring is still we're still in spring. So, but it's on a list of things that we're working through over the next few months.
Did you amend your draft at all as a result of the input of the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, or had you already taken all their points on board?
Well, we work with DIPTAC on everything we do, basically. I think the inputs to the safety code have come from all directions, actually, because it's one of those kind of core documents, because it will have taken account of, any particular kind of, coroner's cases or whatever it may be that over time. And it's another example of where, of course, we talk to the industry a lot, because they're the ones with the experience of what is working and not working, particularly local authorities, who will be observing all the time where works are not carried out to an appropriate standard. So.
And obviously the improvement, it needs to improve, lead to improvements for vulnerable road users and bring the safety code in line with the other DFT guidance around inclusive mobility. And I think a number of highway authorities have in their submissions made suggestions for improvements, and obviously we'll look to, so for example, temporary traffic lights should have a pedestrian phase to allow crossing where that isn't, when that's possible already. And obviously the code will be issued for consultation, including with groups representing people with disability, so it won't be a kind of like here it is and go. Yeah. We'll be able to to further improve it on that basis. And one of the things that I'm keen that we also look at within that is measures to protect people who are working on site, because I don't know that it's come out particularly in your evidence sessions, but I'm very conscious that road workers themselves, the people who are working on the road, whether for utilities or for highways authorities, are often subject to abuse and in some cases subject to dangerous incursions by drivers, and I'm keen that we make sure that we remind local authorities and utility operators about the importance of keeping their workforce safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine?
In Derby, and I think up and down the country, we often see examples where it's the same roads that seem to be dug up time and time again, and the coordination between local authorities and other companies is so important. What can be done and to ensure that we get consistently good coordination to stop that happening?
So I think the rules are there. So there is the local authorities have a role, that it's a duty. They should try to coordinate street works, and there's a duty on the utility companies to cooperate with that process. So the system is designed to bring people together in order to have that coordination happen. But we've seen that it is challenging. So half of the works that happen are the minor works, so the ones where they're going to take 3 days or less. And so the notice for applying for a permit for that is, I think, 3 days in advance. That was why I was going back to my answer to Ms Blundell, was around the importance of advance notice and having those longer term meetings, so you can find out from the utilities what are your plans for the next few months. So that enables, but the opportunity for coordination when utility companies are doing small works at relatively short notice is pretty limited. I think the bigger opportunities for coordination is obviously where someone's doing a more major works, including the highway authority themselves. If they're planning to do a major bit of road resurfacing, you would hope they would. Not you would hope. That's the whole point of the duty to cooperate, is to say, find out information, make sure that you're telling other people what you're planning to do. Is there an opportunity to do your works at the same time? Now, that's the theory. In reality, it can be really difficult, even where there's a major work plan, where you've heard evidence to this effect, that everyone says, oh, that sounds good, and then they can't make it work with their other requirements because, people are working to different requirements. And if you're the utility company and you're told that when you get contacted by a customer asking for, to get a new connection, and they have to meet a timescale, it isn't always possible to say, well, we'll delay because we know they're going to be doing more major roadworks in a few weeks' time. But in theory, that's how the whole system is built, to enable that coordination to happen. Because I know how frustrating it is when you see repeated works by different companies over a period on the same road.
The evidence that we heard was that local authorities are required to hold meetings to coordinate, but that actually companies weren't required to attend them. So does more need to be done to require companies to attend coordination meetings?
Well, the duty is exactly the same. It's for local authorities is that you should hold coordination meetings, and for utility companies is that you should cooperate. So there's an expectation that they should be turning up to those meetings. I mean, I think there is I think for local authorities, I'd be willing to look at this. Is there a question about saying, well, you don't have access to the permit system if you're not cooperating with it, or that you kind of name and shame? I mean, I think you would be having to escalate it to more senior management and say, hang on, why are you not turning up for the meetings? That said, if there's turning up to a meeting and there's actively participating in it and doing it in a useful way.
I think just getting them to turn up sounds like it would be a step in the right direction. It's great that you're willing to look at how that can be facilitated, encouraged, or enforced.
I suspect it's variable between different places. I'm sure there will be examples of where there are good relationships. I mean, I know there are examples of good relationships where those things are happening, that the meetings are happening. There's also examples of where local authorities and utility companies have people co-located in regional hubs. So you've actually got people working side by side with each other, which obviously makes that communication much stronger, rather than just the however often they are quarterly coordination meetings.
Do you think that forward planning notices should be made mandatory?
It's something we could look at. I mean, obviously the permits are the mandatory part of it. If you want, given that a lot of the works are being carried out at relatively short notice, I don't know whether you'd get the value out of making those mandatory. Whether they've got, but there's no reason not to. I don't see any reason why utility companies wouldn't be sharing their advance plans, it would be helpful to do so. I don't know, Anthony, if you want to add to that.
Well, I think I think we come back to the same thing we were discussing earlier, that it's a bit like there's a 10-year meeting, there's a 10-year meeting, there's a forward plan, it would already be good practice. Again, I'd come back to the point that most of what we're talking about here is exactly what Hawke should be trying to achieve through the guidance it issues, because there should be a standard. That's the point, that there should be a standard, and Hawke should be encouraging all of its members to do everything that's basically in the interests of better collaboration and coordination, because they'd all agree that that is the standard. Now, whether it would be better if we were to mandate something, we're always, those are the things that we're always keeping under review. But I suppose the kind of general point is that in such a complicated system, there's always lots of things that we could do. Each one would require, consultation, a lot of resource. So we have to kind of pick and choose quite carefully which are the things that are best done by mandate, and which things are better done through codes of practice or better done by guidance notes, and just encouraging the right cultural approach. Because if you can get the culture right, then regulation becomes less important. And there's always a little bit of a danger in such a regulated environment that we kind of move to making things rules as the first port of call, when in fact it should be the last port of call, because the less we have to get involved, the better. And that's why I think it's better for the sector to work out for itself what it thinks is the right standard, and then try to make sure that works. And what we can do is reinforce that and support that.
Yeah, thank you. Elsie?
Thank you. The department's written evidence said that more thought was needed about the coordination of telecommunications works in particular. In my constituency, there's an operator installing masts all over the place with little regard for what the local authority wants or what residents want. What's your assessment of the challenges, particularly when it comes to telecommunications works, and how will you take this evidence forward?
I think obviously there have been a big increase in telecommunications works and a lot of new operators in the space. So I think it is about making sure that they're party they're part of this. I don't know if you can set out a little clearer what the specific problems are.
Yes, just that there are don't seem to be any restrictions on this particular operator putting masts wherever it wants to, really, without listening to what the local authority wants or what residents want. So I won't get too much into the specifics. Like
a planning issue rather than a street works issue.
Yeah, it's not so much masts, it's actually the telecoms, the wiring,
yes.
The wiring that's going through the roads. One of the witnesses from the local authority side said that it's really difficult to get utilities, even in the same area, to coordinate. So there was even an example of where a local authority had to close a road completely for 6 or 9 months or something because of some bridge works. So they offered to all the utilities, do you need to do any work on this road? And we won't charge you fees because we've got the road's closed anyway, and it'll have to be resurfaced at the end. I think that was the deal. And they went to all the utilities that operate in their area, and they got no response. All of the utilities said, no, we don't need to do any work. They did the bridge work, reinstated the road surface, reopened the road, and then within a year, 2, 3, I don't know how many utilities came in and dug up that road. And we've heard that there's every incentive in utilities not coordinating with other utilities because it impacts on their insurance or their risk liability, whatever.
Commercial sensitivity. Commercial
sensitivities. That was the other one. Thank you. And it is, do you have any sense of that being a concern, or that you can provide any guidance or even regulation on that?
There are restrictions when a road has just been resurfaced. So
I may be wrong about the resurfacing bit, but the idea that you get the gist of my.
I absolutely get the gist of what you're saying, which is when there appears to be an ideal opportunity for coordination, why doesn't it happen? And I get, I mean, there can be a variety of reasons, can't there? As you heard in evidence, you know, utilities are operating at different depths. If you're talking water companies, you know, they're having to do deep excavation. If you're talking telecommunications companies, it's often under the pavement rather than under the roads. So it won't always sit easily. Also, of course, there, you know, as you know, a number of the works will be to deal with more urgent matters, and you know, they're not planned a long way in advance. But what we do want is for where there is the opportunity for coordination, for it to happen. But I think, you know, that the figures that I had around the numbers that were actively coordinating and working together was small relative to the number of total jobs that there are, and that might just be that it is difficult. You know, it's really hard to say, because, you know, for utilities, they're also having to meet other requirements set on them by regulators, and if they're having to operate in particular timeframes to meet other regulations, clearly that makes it more difficult to coordinate at a local level when it comes to doing the street works. I don't know, Anthony, if you want to add to that.
Well, all I was going to say, I think that's exactly the point, and so it's probably more than commercial sensitivities. That's one of the factors, but it's, you know, different commercial drivers, and they're at odds with, which is, as we've already said, is one of the kind of fundamentals of why street works is difficult. I suppose the challenge for us would be that whilst there are plenty of things we're doing which are enabling and facilitating. So, for example, updating the street manager service, which kind of underpins most of what of how the kind of permit system works, to allow forward plans to be added to it. So that's something that we are doing as a kind of part of an improvement kind of project for street manager. So that's enabling. I suppose the challenge for us is how much further do you go beyond making it possible for it to happen, and making it simple for it to happen, and actually then making it happen and sort of enforcing it. And that's, as I say, that's when it gets harder, because then we're into having to specify through guidance, which is a long, painful, consultative process. Whereas actually creating the tools like Street Manager to make it easier for everybody to do that job. So they haven't got the excuse of saying, oh, well, I can't do that because there's no way to do it. Well, yes, there is. There's a way to do it through Street Manager. And the more we centralise through a single system like that, the easier it should be to get that better consistency. But I think, as the Minister said, if you look at the number of works that are actually where there is coordination from our own data, it's quite small, but that's probably just in the nature of the types of works where it is easier to coordinate because they are planned much further ahead. And so, you know, majority of works are short-term, small works where it is very difficult to know, and because they're managing, you know, in a live environment with multiple gangs, so they've got resources that they have to deploy all the time. So making decisions, everything that is flexibility as a compromise has a cost. So for the utility, they have to kind of work through that process to work out and it's about, are we getting the incentives in the right place, bearing in mind that they're all regulated and have targets to meet.
As I say, we did get specific evidence about the active disincentive to coordinate. But anyway, I'll move on because Alex has an important point on this coordination issue.
Thank you. In my constituency, there was an example of 5 different organisations digging up the same road over the course of a couple of months. And one of the reasons for that was the road was right next to a new build housing estate, all of whom need water and gas and broadband. The local authority said to me that they were unable to identify any collaboration opportunities, and also highlighted the fact that there were 4 different developers building these homes. There's going to be a lot more home building over the next few years. Do you think there might be a need for particular guidance when there are new build developments happening, and do you see this as a particular issue?
I mean, I think, you know, it's incredibly challenging in those circumstances that you've described. And obviously developers operate, you know, they will be wanting different utilities at different times. And I think, you know, I recall from the evidence that whilst getting the water in might be an early thing, getting the electricity in. I mean, I think we can look at whether there's more that we could do to ensure that developers are sharing information with the local authority about what their plans are and about the timeframes. Obviously, you know, there isn't a requirement, but, you know, they can get planning permission. It can be quite a long time before they set out their their schedule of works. But everything that encourages that to happen, for that sharing of information to happen. But ultimately, I guess, we can, if we put more requirements on them, we'll build more cost and difficulty into it. Because if we were saying, well, you've got to forward plan, then they'll have to place all the orders at the earliest time. But certainly, it strikes me that there's possibility of providing guidance in that area, so that we can at least set out what good practice might look like. I don't know whether it's something that's been looked at in relation to developers in the past.
Well, it has, but probably not for some time. And I think this is one example of a lot of tension, I think. It's another angle, if you like, another perspective on street works, which is where it interacts with housing development, because there's a whole series of different interactions around disruption, and also things about like road adoption or whatever it may be, that where again you've got strong commercial and political drivers making things happen that come into contact with each other, and they're happening in real time. So our ability to kind of respond to that is not that straightforward. Also, it's partly about evidence, because it's one of these things where there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence, but maybe not that much very clear-cut objective evidence that would allow us to be able to change policy, and which we obviously then need to kind of consult on, having assessed the evidence and having a definite case for change, because that's the challenge that we have in responding to these sorts of problems.
Thank you. Catherine?
If I can follow up on that before this question, because I think that I think you're absolutely right. People have a lot of sympathy if it's an emergency works or things that can't have been planned well in advance. I think the frustration comes where, and you're right that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that really maybe needs to be brought together. I think the concern comes that when there does seem to be the opportunity to coordinate, the disruption caused to residents seems to be at the bottom of the list of priorities for those involved when they are planning works. So anything that can be done to look at better coordination and how that can be better motivated, I think would be really helpful. I think we've all seen examples of street works where it just looks like nothing is happening when you go by. And sometimes there can be good reasons for that. But we also had a lot of evidence that said that duration of street works often expands to fill the time given by the permit. So one example was they might fix the issue on day 1 or 2, but not reinstate the road until day 5. I think other examples that could be really disruptive included road closures and traffic lights left in situ even after the site gang has gone, because it wasn't their responsibility to clear that away. So is it something that government plans to address, or is it just going to be left to companies to set out how they're going to continue their work even when it costs significant disruption to local residents?
So, I mean, obviously highway authorities can use permits and the permit conditions to set the duration of works and require working on particular days and at particular times, because obviously we don't want works to be in place any longer than is absolutely necessary. Now, obviously, there can be disadvantages, so you can use permit conditions to require weekend working if that's needed. So you might do that for major works on major roads and target those works where they're going to cause the greatest impact on congestion. But you probably wouldn't want or expect there to be 7-day working on minor residential roads, and it might not be desirable, and 24-hour working wouldn't be desirable for local residents from a sort of noise and environmental perspective. Also, the time of year will vary about whether you want to work in daylight when it's generally safer than working at night. And obviously, if you put a requirement on to work 24 hours or work at the weekends, then you are obviously probably building in extra cost that will be passed on to to customers. But the other place where the obviously there's an opportunity is about lane rental schemes, where they can also be used to incentivise works on the busiest roads at the busiest times being completed as soon as possible.
I can understand not wanting to work for really long hours over really long periods. I think the concern is often where nothing is happening just because it sits with different teams or because they've booked it in advance to say we'll clear it up at the end, but actually the work's been done much faster. So there doesn't appear to be any incentive to do it faster if their permit allows a full 5 days.
Well, I mean, and that's why I think, you know, it comes back to the local authority setting the permit conditions. Because it is a permit, it's a request for permission, and local authorities can go back and ask further questions about the length of time that's required, about the traffic management that's required. It isn't just the utility company shouldn't just be telling the local authority. It is supposed to be something that's seeking permissions.
There might be opportunities for greater flexibility within a permit that says if things are done
we'd expect
faster,
them to get things
faster.
out and to report that as soon as possible. Anthony, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, to some extent it comes down to the difference between what the local authority may well know but the residents don't. So as you say, when we observe an inactive site, there may be a perfectly good reason why that is the case, and the local authority may well be happy about it because they know about it and it's all part of the plan, but doesn't help the person who's disrupted by it. So again, one of the challenges, I guess, is about better communication, so it's clear why something is happening, because it won't be obvious to them. Why should anybody be an expert about curing concrete? They shouldn't be. There's no need for them to know that, but it might be helpful to be able to communicate better about why a site is where it is and what it's doing. I suspect there is a lot more knowledge behind the scenes between the utility company and the street works team in the local authority, who will have discussed the permit and probably been on site and talked about it. So that may well have happened, but as I say, that doesn't then necessarily translate into information that is helpful to someone who's held up in a traffic jam. And that is, again, is just sort of part of the way the system works. And as you've kind of alluded to, it's there are multiple people involved in different links in the chain, and that requires a lot of very careful kind of coordination and planning to maximise it and to change it. Because if something finishes early, you've got to get another team involved to come and remove traffic lights or whatever. And that sounds straightforward for one work, but when you're managing hundreds of works in an area, that probably isn't that straightforward. And that's probably where the frustration comes from.
I think communication there is room for improvement on communication, and I understand that if you're coordinating multiple projects, then actually having the time and resource to acknowledge when something is finished early and make sure you've got a rapid response to alter the traffic systems that might be put in place. But I think that's why there's some concern about whether local authorities have got the capacity to be able to ensure that these things are done quickly, or whether there's other ways of enabling better coordination so when things can be done faster, they are. Yeah.
And it was one of the things we're trying to do through various kind of digital improvements that we're making through Street Manager and other things, is to move to a world where, because there are two parts to this. One is minimising the amount of disruption, so minimising the amount of time on the ground. So if you can finish early, we'll finish early. And then the second thing is to share that information as real time as possible, so that when you're looking on Google Maps and trying to plan your journey, it will tell you what's actually happening, not what the system said should be happening, because that's not always very useful to you, because you turn up and there's no works there at all, or you find a work that wasn't supposed to be there. If we can get a better alignment between what's actually happening on the ground and the information that can be shared, because a lot of site supervisors or whatever will now have all that information to hand, and they'll be able to communicate it through to street managers just through an iPad. So there's no kind of going back to the office and typing things in anymore. This should all be happening in real time. But that doesn't solve the kind of the coordination behind the scenes point, which is a slightly different issue.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I mean, in the construction industry, the considerate contractor scheme, which we know as users of this estate, we can see the quality, high quality information about what will happen, when it will happen, when it's going to be finished, whether it's going to be noisy or not, whether we'll be allowed to use this route or not. There's clearly a standard that as building users we can experience. So, there is good practice there, and it does sound as if the highways world could possibly pick up some tips.
I mean, I think there is good practice out there in the highways world, that there will be places where this is happening really effectively, and local authorities, and perhaps inevitably, coming to the committee are telling you about the things that are not going so well, rather than the things that are routinely going, that just work. And where there are good relationships.
Yeah. Okay. How can we share that good practice? I think that absolutely people will be first to complain. Though usually some areas will be first to also say when something's going really, really well. But how can we try and ensure we're driving standards upwards so that we're sharing that good practice? And is there a role in government in enabling that coordination?
Well, I mean, that's one of the specific purposes of the Hawke committees, is to share good practice and guidance about what works, because that is by the people who are doing it day in, day out, and that's why we rely on Hawke to provide some of that guidance, specifically as practitioners, because they can share what works and come together to agree it.
It's helpful. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. I'm now going to ask some questions about permit schemes, which I know will fill us all with joy and enthusiasm. Local authorities have told us that they think immediate permits are being overused, and that can make it difficult to plan and coordinate works. But the department has said that they see no evidence of misuse. Does it concern you that immediate permits are being used around 30% of all street works?
I mean, I think it obviously there's been an increase in the amount of the immediate urgent repairs. Now, that could reflect... It's hard to... I mean, inevitably, one can understand that this suggestion that there is abuse of the system. What we haven't been able to do is to verify whether there's abuse of the system, because when the DFT's spoken to companies, they're not kind of admitting that there's a tendency to do that.
Well,
obviously,
we know,
but they well, precisely. But obviously, we also know, and when we're looking at the numbers of immediate urgent repairs, they are predominantly highway authorities themselves, so which you can understand, because we've got a lot of broken roads. If you need to go and do an emergency repair to a pothole that's dangerous, you need to do it urgently. And water companies, and to some extent we think that is not just is that water companies are not doing proactive repairs, and therefore they're waiting until something becomes urgent in order to do it. Now, that might not be what we would like, and it obviously isn't good practice. We'd want much more, but that's true of highways as well. You want preventative maintenance rather than waiting till something becomes really urgent. Pothole repairs, more bad weather, restoring connections, all of those things could be part of what's led to an increase in the urgent repairs. Nevertheless, I still think there's the opportunity to, even accepting that perhaps there are more urgent repairs needed, I think there is more that can be done.
And in that context, for a long time there's been these definitions of urgent and emergency for types of permits. Do you feel those definitions are still fit for purpose, or could do with a review?
I mean, I think I've not heard any suggestion that immediate emergency, where there's a danger to life, is in need of significant change. And indeed, the percentage of works under that category has actually gone down in recent years, where the immediate urgent has gone up slightly. Absolutely agree that we could look at whether there's an opportunity to tighten the definition of those works, and we're working with Hawke to update the coordination code of practice and make it clearer when they can be used. But we're also looking at the timescales for submitting those immediate, both urgent and emergency permit applications. So at the moment they have to be sent within 2 hours of being on site, but we can look at whether that should be shorter, or indeed even in advance of them actually arriving on site. One of the other things that we've observed is that there can be delays between temporary traffic management equipment being set up and removed when works are taking place, and I guess that goes back to the previous question. So we're considering a national permit condition that would speed up and reduce any delays between those handovers between subcontractors.
Thank you. Some utility companies can go on the highway with traffic management, i.e. Traffic signals, without the need for a permit. This was particularly brought to us by the Transport for Greater Manchester. Do you think that all works involving traffic management, even if they don't involve excavation, should they be required to apply for a permit? And if not, why not?
So I think that there was a change in the code of practice that because there'd been an error in that the code of practice wasn't in line with the legislation, so it's just been returned to be in line with the legislation now. I'm struggling to find my bit of information.
You think that might have been rectified?
No, I think if we were going to change back to the matters, so there are works that. So there are specified works which are the things that need to be carried out under a permit, and those were agreed with Hawke following consultation. So anything that involves works that must be carried out under a permit involve breaking up or resurfacing breaking up or resurfacing the road, or closing the carriageway, reducing lanes on larger carriageways, and works that it's recommended are carried out under a permit include things like installation of traffic count apparatus and pole testing and applying road markings. So that would, I mean, if there's an argument for there being further extensions to that, I mean, we could look at that. But as I say, the coordination code of practice is in line with the legislation, and I think if we were going to do something extra around changing that, it would probably require the legislation being amended.
Okay, yeah, this is the non-excavation Section 50 licence is required for those that need to install traffic management on the highway, but don't require any other licence. But it's only needed for anyone that is not a statutory undertaker. So statutory undertakers can put traffic management on the road without seeking a permit, which certainly in terms of Transport for Greater Manchester is a problem for them, particularly weekends if they've got a very high volume football games and other things that because a permit wasn't required, they weren't aware of it and therefore couldn't manage the subsequent disruption. But we'll leave that with you for now.
Is that something you could comment on?
No, well, I think it's a good example actually of where, by kind of drilling down a bit to what specifically are the kind of flashpoint, the difficulties that are created by a set of rules that apply in a sort of standard, consistent way. That's to me is probably where kind of good practice guidance, and again comes back to kind of where Hawke could usefully intervene, because there's a set of rules that apply that mean you can do something, but you'd like to think that at the kind of more local level, because what you've just described will apply particularly in certain places at certain times, but may not be relevant elsewhere. So there's the danger that you'd end up changing the rules to meet every circumstance, which is just never going to be possible. What you're describing sounds to me more like the sort of thing that will apply in certain places. So probably just needs to be kind of elevated as an issue, and then encourage the particular places where it's relevant to say, so in these circumstances, your first port of call should be thinking about not doing it at these times. Not you can technically, but don't, because it's not sensible to. And you would have thought reputationally, it's the sort of thing that utility company ought to be mindful of anyway.
Okay, we'll leave that one there for maybe further drilling down, particularly for Greater Manchester themselves. Okay, we're going to move on to fines and charges. Stakeholders welcome the government's proposals to double the fines available to local authorities. These have remained unchanged for a long time, like we're finding quite a few DFT charges, but these have remained unchanged since 2007. Will you commit to regularly reviewing the fines available to local authorities to ensure that they really do act as a deterrent to poor practice?
I think one of my concerns in coming into the DFT is finding that there are a large number of fines, fees and charges that had not been reviewed for a really long time. And obviously, as you know, that there were a number of that there'd already been a consultation on increasing the penalties available with options to increase in line with inflation or to double, and we decided to double those precisely to provide a bit more of an incentive to it for improved behaviour. So for fixed penalty notices have doubled, and obviously overrun charges have now been extended to weekends and bank holidays as well, and those charges will apply later this year. But I absolutely agree we should keep these things under review on a more regular basis.
Did you consider increasing them any further than just doubling them?
Well, that would have required us to carry out a further consultation, so I think we decided to act where we had the opportunity to do so.
Okay. Katie?
Thank you very much, Chair. So when we're thinking about permits and fines, one thing that I hear very often from my constituents and from my local councillors in Kent is that whilst it is possible to fine, I think, up to £10,000 a day for overrunning works, that's only in very specific circumstances. Fines are often something in the region of about £200, £250. If a condition of a permit is that a person has to manage traffic live, and that might cost you £250 or £300 a day, you breach that condition for 4 days, that would cost it, because it would cost you, £1,000 to comply with it, but the fine is only £240. People feel that the incentives are out of whack. What do you think about that, and how do you plan to address that problem?
So, I mean, the fines are a bit of a stopgap, a backstop position, because what we want...
So ideally, we wouldn't get to the point
so
of fines.
We don't really... That's not where we want to get to. I mean, obviously, there are... the fines... There are fixed penalty notices for some of the offences. So, if it's working without a permit, breaching a permit condition, late submission of start and stop notices, and I would expect those to be implemented if they're needed, but then they're not an alternative to actually engaging with the utility company and holding them to account. And local authorities, I think, are doing this on they are going, visiting sites and making sure that that operators are operating in that utility companies are operating in the way that they have been set out in their permit conditions. I mean, I don't know if you want to.
No, I think that's covered it. I mean, one thing we are doing is again coming back to the sort of cultural approach to this. We are able to collect information through Street Manager about what is actually going on about numbers of FPNs. So again, this is data that previously we had no idea about. We'd have had to do surveys, which typically would have got very low responses, and we would have struggled to assemble the evidence to understand how these incentives are actually working, not just relying on expertise and experience of people who've done this for a long time. So the opportunity we have is that we have more information to understand, how the system in total is working. So it's always something that ministers would want to keep under review. The changes we've made recently are the first ones we've made for some time, and that to some extent tells its own story, that this is not, politically the easiest subject to get into. And so if you are going to think about reviewing penalties as a means of delivering better performance, then you are opening a big box. That's the problem. And I think our approach would always be, as the Minister said, to treat penalties for poor behaviour. That's what they're there to do. They're to try and penalise poor behaviour but focus most of our attention on enabling and incentivising, so that you don't get. And I know that's the kind of nirvana, but that's what drives the kind of approach to the kind of policy making that we do, rather than coming back to having a bigger array of bigger fines, because that doesn't necessarily incentivise the local authority in the right way either.
So, I mean, maybe a simpler way of asking the question is, do you think then that the current fine system is working well, provides an effective deterrent in the backstop scenarios that you're talking about?
Well, obviously we're doubling them, and I would hope that we'll be able to look at whether that's effective. I mean, I think in terms of obviously overrun charges, £10,000 per day is significant.
That's quite unusual, though, I think.
Well, the power is there for the local authority to use it if there are those overruns. I mean, I'm willing to look at this situation again if we don't feel it's having the desired impact.
And for more kind of sort of egregious, long-term, systematic failures to perform and meet standards, local authorities can also, take utility companies to court, and they do. So they have more than just FPNs as the kind of the approach to this. They have other kind of tools in the bag.
I mean, I think we could consider other incentives that are performance based. I mean, I think it would require legislation, but whether you could say that utility companies weren't going to be issued with permits until they'd fixed something that was a long-standing issue.
I think Maggie.
Thanks, Chair. Just building on Katie's point, really, there, Minister. Head of Traffic Management at Via East Midlands Limited highlighted a problem with local authorities not being able to raise multiple fixed penalty notices for ongoing problems. For example, 5 days of roadworks, they've not set up the traffic management on day one, they get a fixed penalty notice. There's no incentive for them to correct that for day 2 to 5 because they've already had a fixed penalty notice and they can't get another one. So do you think there should be multiple fixed penalty notices allowed?
I'll have to go away and look at that one. I mean, obviously the whole purpose of it is to. I would anticipate that someone will have gone out to site and said, "Why have you not got your traffic management in place?" And that would result in them actually putting their traffic management in place, especially if they've got a fixed penalty notice. If that's routinely happening, I think that's really concern. Yeah.
I mean, you're right that if the FPN's the cheap option, then why aren't you incentivised to do that? I suppose what I would say is that if you're the local authority, you're going to remember that, and you're presumably going to be thinking about that the next time you get applications for permits to do jobs, because the reputation of your local utility companies is going to be, it's not going to be a secret to you. So you are going to know that. So these are going to condition your approach to the next time that they apply for permits, and you think about the conditions that you might apply. So that, again, there are other ways of dealing with this than simply kind of issuing endless tickets, because that feels like it's not likely to sort of shift behaviour in the right way anyway. So having the ability to do that every day, it might solve one bit of the problem, but I'm not sure it would fundamentally solve what is really going on and what is motivating the behaviour that we're talking about.
It just might be what's needed to change that behaviour.
It might, yes.
On a related note to that, Streetworks UK, some local authorities, a couple of people that we've heard evidence from have called for performance-based fines. So if you are a repeat offender, it essentially sort of ratchets up. I mean, that seems to me a relatively sensible proposal and might go towards a sort of more structural fix that you're talking about. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think, there haven't traditionally been escalating fines, but we could consider that for offences or repeat offenders. But as I say, I would want the focus to be on. I mean, the focus is obviously on incentivising and improving behaviours, but absolutely, if that's what we need in order to focus minds, then that's something that we'd be willing to look at.
I mean, one of the challenges that was raised, particularly in telecoms, and some of the newer broadband providers, there's a lot of new players who come, but they also go, and that is the challenge of the system basing on prior performance. If if that operator is no longer around, and then you've got a new kid on the block.
Yeah, especially if there's less incentive to build a long-term relationship between the Highway Authority, Streetworks, team and the utility companies that they're dealing with, which are, what's been described. It's like you can imagine that happening once, but you would hope that wasn't going to happen repeatedly, because you would be, escalating it and making life more uncomfortable for them, frankly, if someone was behaving or performing in that way.
Okay, we're now going to move on to lane rental schemes. Baggy.
Okay, so some lane rental schemes charge utility companies straight away, while others start charging after day 2 to incentivise them to do the works a little bit quicker. Do you think the incentive should be a feature for all lane rental schemes?
I think, there's flexibility within the lane rental schemes about how they're operated. And I think, generally we've had good feedback from the lane rental, from the authorities that are the 5 lane rental schemes that are operating. They think that's effective. Actually, often the utilities are avoiding having to pay the charges by doing things in a better way, so they'll avoid doing things at the busiest times. I think, it's if there's flexibility within the schemes, they can operate them in the way that they see works best for their area.
Okay, so currently only the strategic authorities are allowed to set up new lane rental schemes without applying to the Secretary of State, rather than all local authorities. Do you think all local authorities should be allowed?
So any local authority can apply to set up a lane rental scheme, and we've set out some guidance about how they can do that, and we've had a number of 8 bids have been submitted this year. We're expecting some more later. We have talked about, we have recently consulted on the proposal to devolve the power to approve new lane rental schemes to mayors, and that's as part of the English devolution white paper, and obviously we'll announce the outcome of that consultation shortly.
Can I just sort of gloss on that, because I think your question slightly presupposed something that hasn't actually happened yet. So we've consulted on mayoral strategic authorities having the ability to approve lane rental schemes, which at the moment is only done by the Secretary of State. So nothing has changed. So we've consulted on the possibility of strategic authorities, mayors taking on that role. We haven't actually responded to the consultation yet, so we've had the responses to it. So ministers haven't yet taken a decision on what they want to do about that particular proposal following the consultation. So I think your question was, well, if you're thinking of letting mayors approve lane rental schemes, I think this is what I'm interpreting.
Yeah,
why can't you extend it? Why just mayors? Well, I think kind of one step at a time. So yeah, the proposal was really because it was very consistent with something that was already happening through the various proposals in the English devolution white paper. So it was a kind of consistent suggestion, which we've consulted on, but we haven't, as I say, we haven't actually yet decided, ministers haven't decided what they want to do about that. So I think we'd need to see what the outcome of that is first, and then see. I think at this early stage because lane rental is still pretty new, we've only had 2 long-standing schemes and a very small number that are now in operation but have really barely started in the last few years. This early on, it may well be that we need to see how it kind of rolls out, because lane rental is not it's not that straightforward to implement, and it's quite requires quite a lot of utility changes of planning and delivery. So I think we probably do need to keep this sort of under review to make sure that it's working the way we want it to work, because I think we've seen that it does demonstrate that it can deliver kind of the changes to the reduction of impacts that we're looking for. But this early on, I think we'd be a bit wary of sort of devolving the entirety of lane rental down to kind of a purely local decision, given the scale of impact it has on utility works.
But if the question was, can highway authorities apply, subject to Secretary of State approval, all highway authorities have that open to them to apply to operate a lane rental scheme.
Yeah.
Okay. So if the new legislation is passed and get the new powers, have you done any work on how many additional schemes do you think will be introduced as a consequence?
So, I mean, I think we're looking at those schemes that we're looking at those ones that have already applied to see how they would to see their proposals for at the moment, and we've issued guidance to highway authorities to help them to develop their bids. I mean, it is the whole purpose of lane rental is for it to be targeted on the most congested roads at the most congested times. The point of them is to incentivise those carrying out the works to avoid the charges by moving the works, so carrying them out at less busy times or carrying out joint works. It's not a way of it's not meant to be a way of raising revenue, and it is for only a proportion of their road networks. But I think obviously it's a developing area because, as Anthony says, we've only got 5 at the moment. Some of those are relatively newly created, and I think we'll see over time how well they're developing and how effective they are, and probably how can they be developed to ensure that they work in the way that we hope.
I mean, we currently have 8 applications under the latest kind of batch that we're looking at, because, as the Minister confirmed, ministers have to decide each and every one at the moment. So we're doing it in two windows a year. So we've just closed a window and we've had 8 applications. We understand that there's a dozen or more, maybe more than that. Lots of authorities are thinking about it, and some are thinking about doing joint schemes. So I know Manchester's been discussing about whether they have a Greater Manchester lane rental scheme, which would involve all of the 10 districts there. So we know that the appetite is quite strong, but I wouldn't underestimate that it does require quite a lot of work to put together the application to design a lane rental scheme, to work out where you're going to put it and how it's going to operate, and it has to comply with the guidance that we've set in order to be able to be successful. So the appetite's there, but as I say, I think local authorities are still working their way through the process of working out whether it would be suitable for them. I think mainly at the moment a lot of urban authorities are thinking about it because that's where a lot of the worst congestion happens. So we shall see.
Right. So there's limited experience that we've got now, but are we learning, and how are we learning lessons from the limited amount of experience we have?
Well, by getting feedback from those authorities that are operating it and seeing what the impacts have. So some of the existing evaluations indicate that utility companies are, and highway authorities, because both are part of the lane rental scheme, so doing their own roadworks as well as utility companies doing street works. It does seem to be changing behaviour. So TfL's most recent report finds that 98% of TfL works avoided charges, whilst 83% of utility works avoided them. West Sussex produced an evaluation report that found more than 91% of total works avoided charges, and Surrey's report, 84% of planned works were taken outside of traffic sensitive times. So that does provide an early indication that in those small number of schemes that we've got in place, it is having the desired effect of keeping the busiest parts of the network clear of works by both the Highways Authority and utility companies, which seems desirable. But obviously, as it expands and as more authorities come in, you'll want to continue to look at those evaluations and also to see whether there's any unintended consequences that we haven't things we haven't anticipated, or any impacts that we haven't anticipated. And as you heard from the utility companies themselves, they're slightly anxious about the additional costs that this would bring in.
So you wanted to come in possibly from the Scottish perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to very briefly return to Scotland. So we did start, right at the start of this meeting, we talked a lot about what we could learn from Scotland. But lane rental is something which is Well, use the word opposed by the Scottish Government. I can remember writing to them when there was a councillor and they said they weren't interested. And I forget their exact reasons, to be honest. And then I think the Scottish Roadwork Commissioner as well isn't a fan. But it seems, I think to me, and I think a lot of residents in Edinburgh, it seems quite logical that this is a way that would encourage utility companies to work faster and also hopefully smarter to reduce the disruption and it, hopefully less likely we'll have roadworks that are just empty because there's a big incentive to get the works. So everything lines up. But if you don't mind, Anthony, you seem to be riding two horses on this. You're saying that you're inviting new applications to come forward and you consider them carefully, but you're also saying there's very limited schemes just now, the evidence base isn't really there, and we have to be sure it's the right thing to do. So are you, I'm going to put words in your mouth, so are you saying that lane rental works, but it's just a matter of fine-tuning it to make sure we've got the right schemes? Or are you saying there's still uncertainty about whether or not lane rental is the right way forward? You seem to be talking about a lot about evidence collecting still, despite also inviting applications to come forward for more schemes.
Well, I think based on that, sorry if I can jump in.
It was
directed at me, so I thought I should. So TfL have had a scheme for several years, so there is a lot of experience. Now London is London, the setup is different, the scale is different, but Kent has had one also for the same amount of time, and Kent is also a kind of useful source of evidence to us. So I think we've got plenty of evidence that shows that it can work. So what I'm talking about is continuing to gather the evidence, as the Minister was saying, making sure that each and every place it's applied, because everywhere will do it slightly differently. They will decide where their traffic sensitive streets are. They will decide where the congestion hotspots are and how to apply it. And what we want to do, obviously, is continue to optimise it. So we think it can work. We think it incentivises, coming back to one of the words we use a lot today, is thinking about how to incentivise the right behaviour. So this is an example of a big intervention, so a big central government intervention that allows a local area to apply a scheme that has very direct impacts on the most traffic sensitive parts of the network. So
it's not about if it will work, it's about how it's going to work and how you get the most out of it.
I think it's more about how will we make it work. And we've updated our guidance. So we have learned from the schemes that we already had, and then the sort of early adopters in the first wave of new lane rental schemes. So we're learning from that, and they're learning from that, and sharing information. So local authorities are sharing information amongst themselves about how to do it. Because if you've never had a lane rental scheme, obviously this is it's a new thing, so we're providing guidance to help that. So I think ministers are very keen to encourage it. I think the evidence base is pretty solid. The data that we do have seems to show that it's doing exactly what we intended, which is to avoid works happening in a way that's disruptive. But of course, the point is we're not saying we've done it. That's an established policy. We're now going to just do more of it. We're going to continue to keep it under review as we do it, to make sure that we fine-tune it to make it work even better.
And to make sure it continues to work, because I think, obviously utility companies can pass on lane rental charges to their onto customer bills. So we want to make sure that actually it's incentivising them to avoid charges. We don't want to put up the prices of everybody's utility bills by doing this. We want them to change their behaviours in terms of the way they carry out the street works to keep it to a minimal level.
Good. Maybe it's time I write to the Scottish Government again.
Alex.
Thank you. A lot of things that the government wants to do, like EV charging points, faster broadband, they all involve digging up roads and pavements. So I wondered if you could outline how you're working across government to ensure the need to manage these works well is understood.
Well, obviously, one of the things that we are doing in relation to EV charging is the proposal to allow EV charge point operators to access the permit system in order to carry out those street works. And I think that is advantageous in the sense that then those works, as far as possible, can be coordinated alongside other works that are happening, on the carriageways, and that highway authorities have that degree of control that they do through the permits system. Obviously, we have regular conversations with other parts of government. There's obviously been quite a lot of conversations with DSIT around the rollout of broadband, and there are currently trials ongoing around flexi permits, which is where a utility company can set out a larger area within which it would be operating, because permits have to be taken for individual streets under the current permit system. I know that highway authorities are slightly nervous about the benefits of that and worried about the implications, so that's why it's really helpful that we've got those trials happening right now in order to kind of look at can it be made to work effectively, can we deal with some of those concerns that are being raised by highway authorities, and also provide some comfort to broadband operators who are, we're obviously keen to see the rollout of broadband, but we don't want it to be at the expense of too much disruption on our roads. So it's about having that balance, really.
I think everyone welcomes the change of status of installation of public EV charging infrastructure to require planning permission for them when that's not required for mobile phone masts does seem to be a bit mad. But so it's good that you're bringing them into line. While on the subject of EV charging, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but will you consider reviewing the cross-pavement charging issue, particularly for householders who live in streetfront properties and want to be able to get a charging cable across the pavement to their home? Apparently that currently needs planning permission. And also, are you doing any work for those drivers who do not have the right to charge, particularly people who live in multi-occupancy flats, leasehold properties and so on, where they currently it's almost impossible to get the ability to charge from home? So I know it's a bit of a diversion from this inquiry.
That's okay. On the cross-pavement charging solutions, I'm really keen that we want there to be a situation where everyone has the opportunity to make the switch to an EV. And obviously it's much easier for those people who've got off-street parking than it is for those who don't. And cross-pavement solutions obviously provide a great opportunity because it enables people to use domestic electricity tariffs to charge if they can park on the street outside their house. Obviously, for all the reasons that we've covered today, there is a concern about when you make a cut through a pavement and making sure that that's done in a proper way. We've issued, and obviously there are a number of different companies offering different sort of gully systems to allow this to operate. We issued new guidance at the end of last year on the operation of cross-pavement charging to help local authorities to make those decisions. Now, it won't work everywhere, it won't be suitable for every location, but we have, as I say, we have issued that guidance to local authorities to hopefully make it easier for them to set their local policies in relation to this. And I know, I get quite a lot of correspondence on it, so I know it's an important issue. On the other question, I asked precisely that question. I happened to be at a school and a little kid was telling me that, we can't have an electric car because our landlord won't let us install a charge point, which obviously is a real concern. Obviously, for newer properties, less of a problem because we've got building regulations that requires charge points to be installed. But absolutely, it's an issue. I don't think it's straightforward because I specifically went and asked that question, but it's certainly something we're very mindful of and working out how we can try to come up with ways of dealing with that issue. But it's very much in my mind.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly as a former planner, a gully across a pavement would, to me, be de minimis. And anyway, as you say, it's the wrong area of legislation to be dealing with this stuff. Planning, it's not appropriate for planning. It's much more appropriate towards street.
We want it to be easy,
street
but we
permit.
want it to be safe.
It's a street permit thing, I would have thought. Scott, you wanted to come in at this point?
It's a really interesting area, actually, because I think we all know people who believe they have the right to park outside their house. We all know those people. But I do worry that this would make that worse. And I do worry about cables being over footpaths, because even if you get it through the gully, there's still a cable at the other end of the gully that somehow you have to connect to the car. But I've got a mobility operation in my constituency, and they're trialling in Edinburgh, I don't know where they're trialling, But they made the point, of course, that the people who are most likely to be inconvenienced by cables, etc., people with mobility problems, disabilities, but they're also the people that find it hardest to use charging points, commercial ones, and how having been able to charge outside their house, they're the ones that are going to benefit most. So there is a bit of an equalities aspect to this for people who are lucky enough to be able to afford a car, either through their own resources or via mobility. But it is a real challenge actually about maintaining accessibility. Permits, etc. aside, the accessibility, there's arguments on both sides. It's really tricky. So I don't envy you. I don't envy you.
I think there are some really big issues around it. There are issues around the siting of EV charge points full stop, because obviously anything that adds to the things that are on the pavement can, as we know, can make it more difficult for disabled people to get out. There's issues around the accessibility of public charge points. There is a standard, but unfortunately, we found that it isn't yet being used. We're reviewing the standard, working with. I held a round table on this very issue with a number of organisations, including those representing disabled people and the charge point operators, to look at how can we make sure the standard is fit for purpose, but also make sure that it's that it's actually going to be adopted by the charge point industry. And actually we know there are quite a lot of disabled people who have made the switch to an EV because of the Motability scheme, and they've been able to do that. So it's really important that we make sure that we are building accessibility in at every stage of this transition, not doing it as an afterthought, and absolutely give that commitment.
And our local Royal Mail sorting office is looking at we're told the Royal Mail are looking at where there's not enough space for the upright charge points. They're looking at some kind of roll-on, roll-off floor-based charging, which might, with a side window access for paying, might be a solution. But I don't know. But certainly they're looking at it from the point of view of tight space. Anyway, we were slightly diverting from the very important issue of street works permits and the way the legislation is or isn't working for the benefit of our constituents, businesses, pedestrians, drivers and so on, who are so inconvenienced too often by street works. So we'd like to thank you very much for coming to this final session of our inquiry and giving your evidence today. And as always, do feel free to write to us with anything that you feel you haven't been able to cover sufficiently in your answers this morning. I think we've all found this very valuable. We'll be considering our recommendations to you on this topic, and of course we look forward to your subsequent response. That concludes today's meeting. Order.